Yeah, so I welcome you all to day two, session three of Cosmopolitan Cultures and North Indian Thought, Thinking Through History Across the Waters. So there are two paper presenters, two senior academic who will be presenting their work in this session. Without much delay, I quickly call upon Professor Alok Bhalla just to give you a brief and modest bio of Professor Bhalla. Professor Bhalla is a widely published critic, translator, and poet. He has research fellowships from a variety of academic institutes and retired as professor of literature a few years ago. So over to you, Professor Bhalla.
Thank you. I have great difficulty with our connection here. So I can't generally hear what is being said, and the voice just breaks. So the decision really is that I will speak for about the first 5 minutes very quickly and forego my rights or my position as a chairperson after the speech. So please bear with me for a few minutes. I won't take more than 3 minutes um, to say a few things about the nature of this seminar and then invite Geeta, if that's all right with you. Is that acceptable? Yeah, okay. So first, thank you, Dilip, Nishat, for this invitation. I'm, of course, always eager to renew my association with Jamia's English department. Over the decades, I have watched a steady sea change in the department's research and teaching programs. And the department, it seems now, once again, is seriously trying to abandon what is, with proper theological piety in India, still called the canon of English literature. Because really, it is nothing more than our colonial heritage and is like Mrs. Havisham's cake, rather moldy. Um, this seminar, the seminars that I've attended over the last year at Jamia have helped me to take new soundings. I use the word deliberately because I think it's a very beautiful and wonderful nautical word from Moby Dick. And I'd Moby Dick of texts, so soundings of texts and ideas that I have once known. The Gandhi seminar, for instance, made me think about the Mahatma's vast knowledge of music, ceramics, painting, Afro-Americanism, and wonderfully atheism. And for the seminar on literature and disease, I found Susan Sontag's illness as metaphor helped me realize how dangerous it always is to confuse the body in pain with morality, religion, and social will. Now, for this seminar on the cartographers and cartographies of the sea and myths, cultural exchanges, slave tragedies, pirates, legends about drowned cities, ancestral voices, sea burial of books, which have been transformed into magic casements, I sought out W.H. Auden's wonderfully nuanced book called The Enchafed Flood as my guide. I don't know whether many of you know this old text. Now, Auden reminded me that the sea is always both as the source of most cosmogonies and the cause of final dissolutions in the imagination of civilizations. Hence, the word sit and chafed, suggesting the energy of creation and the rage of destruction. It is between cosmogony and eschatology that the great epical texts like the Bible and the Mahabharata tell their stories about divine origins and the sudden fall into secular time, where there are rough conflicts, endless sufferings, and death. Auden guided me back to that strange and spectral book 5 of the Prelude, in which Wordsworth talks about how, paradoxically, knowledge always results in loss of power and suffering. How life's innocence and goodness is always swept away, as he says, like withered leaves, by the mysterious winds of pain, doubt, and fear. Now, sitting in a rocky cave by the seaside, what has been called literal space in this seminar, he's reading Don Quixote. And as he's reading it, the poet has a dream vision of an Arab horseman who carries a seashell in one hand and a stone in the other. The literal space within the liminal time of a dream becomes the meeting place of an English poet, a Spaniard, and an Arab. The communication between them, however, does not have the quick and ease of comprehension which is called creolization in this seminar, nor does it have the comfort of what has also been labeled as cosmopolitics over the last 2 days. The horseman who carries a lance also tells the dreamer that both the seashell and the stone are books. One is the book of visionary history, that is poetry of all articulate sounds, as he says, and the other is a book about the rigidity and sacrificial violence in temples and by authoritarian political structures. Blake would have called them Euclidean geometry and pyramids. Now, as Wordsworth struggles to decode the vision sitting on the seashore, he has intimations of the idea that a significant poet must neither be a singer of present power nor be lost in oceanic feelings. The first may make him crass and heartless, the second may render him a sentimental lotus eater and irrelevant. Now, what I'm trying to suggest in the context of the seminar is that as one reads the flow of tides and ocean winds, one must remember that one must remember one must remember that those who live on land also carry their moral compass with them. That sea navigators and land travelers also struggle to create networks of ideas and exchanges, find modes of sharing and resistance, all words that have been used in this seminar. And more often than not, both fail in the face of relentless power, greed, and contempt, and imperial arrogance. One should not presume that seafarers and landlubbers read nature and society in radically different ways. Again, something that has been done in this seminar. The great nautical writer, Herman Melville, worked in a customs house, and Coleridge's plea for compassion for all things great and small was not delinked from lectures against slavery in slave plantations and British factories. The politics of the sea and landlocked cities is not distinct. The sea and land have their monsters and goddesses, their chimeras and their oases. The ship replicates the structure of the state, as Melville does brilliantly in Billy Budd, and is equipped with the whipping rack. That is why there are mutinies by sailors, just as there are strikes by workers. And the pirate, like the bandit, has the aura of freedom and romance. Must we not therefore wonder, standing on the seashore with Wordsworth, if it is ever possible, either in the narratives of the sea or in the histories of earth-grounded states, for good human beings like Ishmael Queequeg, the ancient mariner, Billy Budd, or Don Quixote, to escape the fate of being the eternal outsiders, and will always conclude when we wake up that no one is ever spared except in dreams. Now,
Alok, you
I'd
have
like to
30
stop.
seconds more. You have 30
Yeah.
seconds more before we move on, because the slot is very tight.
I'm done. I'm done. May I now invite Geeta? May I invite now Geeta to give her talk on entitled Found in Prison, the Poetics of Oceanic Histories. Geeta is a professor at the University of Virginia, and she has 3 degrees in science and a doctorate from Columbia. And she has published the one book I know, which is absolutely splendid, is a book on Miraji called Lyrical Movements, Historical Hauntings. And she has recently published a book which sounds both risky and wonderful, called Risky Bodies and Techno Intimacies. She's also, I learned, working on Isma Chugtai. May I invite Geeta to give her talk?
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to ask Dilip to let me go a minute. I timed this. I think I'm a minute over. So I wanted to thank the fabulous organizers, all three of them here today, my fantastic co-presenters, attendees, my fellow seafarers, and honor the Monacan nation from whose land I speak. Introductory covenants. I want to narrate a tale from a poor person's history of finance, the annals of those who are non-entities in most conventional histories, protagonists drawn up through lives knotted into one or another kind of capital. One is Captain Francis Lynch, a free mariner not attached to company or crown. though he was drafted by both, who cruised between the East African coast and as far as the Philippines. Lynch tacked in and out of the Spice Islands, found himself indebted beyond repair, floated a series of pleas from prison that formed the basis of my own meditations on ocean histories and vagaries. In Lynch's case, the vagaries of ocean seafaring have to be convincing to those who are terror-bound or pursue the sea along routes that don't tally up with Lynch's. But it's as though it's through those who seem of no accord that one can see someone profound, even transformatory about capital, those like Lynch, what capital services, what shapes its conditions. Beyond this, people of no account during times of dire tribulation often produce the conditions for such transformations, even as those times of crisis produce the buoys through which everyday habits, inculcated through and that underpin political economies, drift to the surface into view. These non-entities in the historical record substantially rescript, remap, or upturn the fail-safe narratives that ballast histories of capital. Following upon a now robust, hardly conceived, flourishing literature on oceans, I want to ask, as rosters of others have done already, how does the fluvial liveness of marine metaphorics redirect how questions are posed, what we respond to them with? In this essay, traveling along through Lynch's pleas, I trace the ways in which the following flow in and out of each other: pleas, petitions, compensation, trust, interstitial, oceanic politics, musical aesthetic, benevolence, national sentiment, finance, oceanic capital, Mariners' Straits. I can solemnly declare on oath to the Governor General and Council, and likewise prove, that when I incurred the losses and expenses, I was not worth an anna in the world. I have from this and other voluntary services rendered to king and country so completely ruined myself, I'm afraid I shall not be able to extricate myself from any debt by any employment whatsoever, which I may be able to procure in the mercantile line. Laboring under these distressed circumstances, I hope the Governor General and Council will be pleased to take my case into consideration, afford me that justice which the British nation is renowned for its benevolence to the poor and undeserving. Poor and deserving. I love the undeserving. By ordering the total amount of my claim, as undermentioned, for interests and losses already stated, to be paid to me, together with any remuneration as I may be thought deserving of. These are the closing pleas in a concluding memorial by Francis Lynch, sent on a merchant vessel by the Governor General and Council in Calcutta to the Court of Directors in the East India Company in 1806. Lynch is in a financial mess, attempting desperately for the 8th time to beg for compensation. He owes money for insurance on the boat he's sailing. He's in hock to investors. He's had to borrow money from unspecified Bengali financiers, as well as a British firm in Madras, Joseph Barreto and Company. No one is willing to roll over his debt. Lynch's creditors are landlubbers, his ventures, both literally and in their empathetic registers, oceanic, and this sets up fiscal incommensurabilities where creditors have no capacity to tally up the seafaring vagaries that beset Lynch. He is a key player in a roster of sagas, chock-a-block with many more familiar names, but fewer less significant than his. And we find him skulking in the archives as he traverses a fraught history of European interstitial history. And I call it interstitial because it's between free mariners, companies, and countries. And I work off Laura Doyle's formulations. Lynch comes to archival notice when he lays his claims before Calcutta. It's only through his refashioned the aesthetic of his compositions laid before the East India Company, which they sometimes call petitions or epistles. And in Urdu or Farsi, we might term a faryad, an arzi, or an arzdasht, that Lynch narrates what we as readers come to understand something of his various journeys. Through his sojourns, we also come to see what surfaces and seems to count in shaping and hewing claims and the rooting of political geographies in oceanic entanglements. One of his many travails is set between 1790s and 1810s. This is the basis of the pleas on which I commenced. This is a story, and Lynch is on one of his stopovers in Calcutta. Stephen Cook, who is a commander of a Royal Navy boat is stuck on land, his ship in dry dock. Cook begs Lynch's aid and promises that Lynch will not only be compensated for every expense, but given a little extra for his services. Cook's been chasing down a French frigate near Prince of Wales Island, Penang. Somehow a whole cohort of his sailors are captured at Pollock Harbor, cast adrift, detained by pirates. And in this case, pirates are often local resistors. Cook asks Lynch to stop in Maguindanao if he's going to inquire about the fate of his sailors. Lynch sets off in November 1798, soon after Cook's request, and goes out of his way to stop in Maguindanao and is driven off the coast by a gale, forced into a fortnight's delay. The pacing of the sea's moods, the gathering of wind, the thrum and roar of waves breaching and breaking, struggling to beach, those are the tempos that throw the measure of rooted retained time, the point of a map where a ship is expected to put into port into utter disarray. Place and time have been misplaced or displaced. The next year, 1799, again in November, sailing season for favorable winds, Rich is off to Mboina. And his ship's called Bangalore. He's in the employ of Barreto, holds 1/4 of the concern, has taken a loan on goods on the collateral of his name, and his investors expect to make a massive profit. He stops at Jolo in the Sulu Sea and is informed by Prince of Maguindanao that the local sultan has captured 9 of Cook's seamen, the rest are dead. Lynch goes out of his way to retrieve the sailors. He comes to port, parleys for the release, and finesses his way through a series of circumstances that place him over and over again in danger. He redeems them in 2 ways. Pays the Sultan the form of Spanish dollars, which is ironically one of the few acceptable forms of currency in many regions, and 4 sailors are let go. The rest he pays in goods as additional compensation for the sailors' upkeep and for ransom. And this is the final 4. On the way to his next situation, he meets a Royal Navy frigate and ferries the sailors over, for whom he receives a receipt. The chit for the body stages evidence, the burden of a transactional economy at sea, one handover in the amassing store that Lynch is accumulating. Choice, pertinent pointers, interstitial economies. In order to understand the conditions that prevail when Lynch is advancing his claims, it's worth logging a few particulars that play into his case. The Bank of England is short of specie, living off paper money, aka a promissory note based on the trust of their word. The Admiralty needs money to fund England's war with France. Dutch and Spanish are entailed in warmongering. Napoleon has taken over Holland. In Holland, the pro-British and pro-French parties are jockeying for power. Anti-slavery advocates are gaining ground in London, even as the independence of the US is a sore point. The East India Company has hemorrhaged money on loans to fund the wars against the Marathas and Tipu Sultan. There's famine in Madras. East India Company in Fort St. George is unable to roll over their loans, just like Lynch, until the Madras factors got a pension fund going. And I work on that as well. So Madras is scarce on trust, food, and specie, leaning on Bengal to redeem their bonds. The silk tea opium nexus is swallowing specie, and the Straits of Malacca and other routes that open up shipping lanes to China are under the gavel in the fraught back and forth between France, Britain, and Holland, which also includes Kochi, by the way. That's also under the gavel. We come to learn through each financial plea that Lynch puts forward, and the sailors are only one. The sailors under slavery are only one. Something of Lynch himself. He served as a translator on record. He's proficient in many local languages, works with regional power brokers. He's intimate with all the small islands and archipelagos. His ships have often been detoured from their trading routes on behalf of Crown and the East India Company. Many British settlements were finagled through his transactions on the behalf of Crown and Company. He's offered suggestions for the British to negotiate with the Dutch. He's filched spice trees from the Dutch, and he may even have been instrumental in ferrying plants that form the nucleus of nutmeg and clove growing in Kerala and Sri Lanka. Ebbs and flows. As our writer reprises the claims he's making, he becomes more and more adept at hewing them in a particular aesthetic key. What does he want? What he says from the outset is he wouldn't be asking for anything at all if he hadn't been driven to poverty and prison. What he's arguing for in 1806 are the following: compensation for kindnesses and humanity, which are his voluntary services, for the time he spent detoured off route, out of sync with the tempos of marine and trade seasonalities, while tendering these voluntary services, and for time, therefore for time lost from an itinerary, augmented by the time used up, worn away on the assistance he delivers. Lynch is expecting the Admiralty and EIC to honor the promises made to Captain Cook, who dies in a naval battle before he can make good. The tidal washes of trust are at stake here. Lynch borrowed on the efficacy and honor of his name and word. As for Captain Cook, Lynch explains he believed Cook to be trustworthy, which is why he was willing to accept Cook's promise. Trust he would have foregone had Lynch known, as he does now, that the promise Cook gave him had no heft or content, would not be honored by those such as the Admiralty for whom Cook died. The Admiralty's ventures on seas are underwritten by paper money, promissory notes ballasted by trust. And the EIC, for whom Lynch has also tendered his ship's services, are failing on their own promissory notes. Trust ensures the flow of promises, and it seems to be dammed up or choked. Lynch is valiantly trying his hand at releasing the stoppages of trust again. He's alerting the East India Company and Admiralty. What he's alerting them to is the content of kindness and goodwill, aka benevolence, which draws all British sailors into a compact with and then seduces them to give everything up for someone else's sovereign jurisdictions. What must be done materially in the name of benevolence and a reliance on it, especially when common people give their lives over to war at sea? Benevolence is something that's emerged as a crucial component in philosophical ruminations on the moral conduct of the state, the armed forces, and the East India Company. It's a refurbished philosophical conceit, and it has solid consequences. 18th century projects that curtail or reorder paupers in the UK are orchestrated around benevolence. It also orients governmentality in the colonies. So the musical aesthetics of compensation. Over Lynch's 8 tries to recap his misfortunes, he gets more and more adept at an aesthetic which is expected to cull benevolence from his ordinance's tight-fisted fiscal hearts, a bit like a ship tacking in and out of brusque gusts. And the courses of this aesthetic are eerily reminiscent of Adam Smith's attempts in the theory of moral sentiments to elucidate where and how benevolence finds its home through fleshy sympathy with someone else, a form of sympathy that owes its allegiances to something that's close to navigational sensing. I'd like to lead us into Smith with a familiar paragraph from the opening pages of the Theory of Moral Sentiments and move on from it to one rarely cited section in chapter 3. I quote, "By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them." And from chapter 3, Smith's paean to music. When music imitates the modulations of grief or joy, it either actually inspires us with those passions, or at least puts us in the mood which disposes us to conceive them. Whatever is the passion which arises from any object in the person principally concerned, an analogous emotion springs up at the thought of his situation in the breast of every attentive spectator. Sympathy, therefore, does not arise so much from the view of the passion as from that of the situation which excites it. Some of what Smith is trying to describe in coming to sympathy through emotions roped together through music, seeping into flesh and being, comes close to and is akin to South Asian aesthetic theory. Smith's passages on music are some of the most unexpectedly heartfelt and beautiful he composes. Musical sympathy is fluvial. But before we encounter Smith's takes on music, he's already taken us along another course of sympathy. We imagine ourselves into the scenarios given to us by someone else. Our fancies, through our fancies, we're nimble enough to fall into the world, living livelihood, flesh and passions of another. Urdu poets refer to this as hamdardi. Promises at sea, whose benevolence? Sympathy then relies on stories. These are the yarns and anecdotes that log oceanic travails and tribulations. The more adept Lynch gets at embellishment, the more finesse he displays at poetics, that makes sympathetic extension possible, the clearer the oceanic becomes. Lynch is struggling to solicit, nay, even train landlubber officials in what being benevolent might mean, what sympathy with sailors whose lives are afloat might entail. What is striking about Lynch's plates is that as someone who is struggling to elicit sympathetic listening, benevolence is, via promises made on sea, on behalf of seagoing, promises constantly withheld that become untrustworthy, though they ought to be honored. Benevolence is what sutures people together. Benevolence is not just a state through which or on behalf of which parties act. It's the act itself that's important, and in the act is the promise. The nation is composed, shaped, given form through this promise in really curious ways. That is, Lynch's benevolence, humanity, or kindness in his lexicon, and he says this quite explicitly, is what he, a sailor, is doing for the nation along routes that are far removed from national shores. And in doing so for the nation, he's actually producing the island nation that is surrounded by the seas and finds its life through marine traffic. Let me explain. Without Lynch's voluntary service on the seas to the nation, of which rescuing sailors under slavery is only one piece, piloted outside the immediate land-based geographical ambit of Britain, albeit an island, there would be nothing for Britain. Maritime service makes the state the institution. Without it, Britain would have no ability to fight on sea, no ocean-based geography with which to hold the Dutch and French hostage, no flow of trade. Ocean materiality, mobility across the oceans is the currency of value. It's the coin for a realm short on specie. Ocean matters, interstitial hydro or amphibious politics matter deeply to landbound European sovereignty, as Hugo Grotius makes clear. But what Lynch is also at pains to show is that when you render voluntary services that bring Britain into being, you render the pauper. Because in particular, you've been given a promise that your service on sea would be compensated in several ways. For itself, the labor, the expenditure you put into it, and the labor that went into performing it, and the losses you incur. The cost of what you forgo when you accomplished what you agreed to do. This promise is what keeps you bonded to performing the voluntary work that produces the nation itself. Lynch says that had he known that the promise given to him by Cook would not be respected, he would have refused to perform as what it invested with value. This threat is more than its supposed jurisdiction. It's literal and allegorical. What it also premises is when voluntary service is withheld or withdrawn, the national compact will come to a halt. This service by the poor who can least afford it and pay their dues in prison feeds the nation into presence. Sent off from land, Lynch's claims on the promises made to him require his kindness, benevolence on the sea, are what shaped the compact which keeps him sailing on, and in the process composing the British nation state. These claims are compensatory, though they too are expected to be responsive to fellow feeling. Compensation here establishes equivalence. Lynch voyages on the transactions based on mercantile capital. He's elaborating a network of abstract contracts that only make sense through amphibious embodied empiricism leavened by sympathy, which is that it is not just labor that must be compensated, but what also falls under voluntary service work. Without this work, circulation itself, capitalism, would grind to a noisy stoppage. Service that is volunteered, not merely demanded. Sympathetic collaboration is also toil, and its grind, in Lynch's case, is fleshing out the nation itself on mercantilist interstitial seas. This is the supplement that will allow Lynch to continue to be a merchant. Without it, he can have no adequate prospects in seafaring. Without it, Britain may even cease to have sustenance. And I have one more paragraph. What Lynch maps for us in his urgent request is this: perhaps all the above only come to our notice when we pay heed to claims and pleas and petitions of the poor, which are not merely made by supplicants on their own behalf, but as mutual promissory assertions. Can we say then that nations, whether they're virulently colonial or no, are composed out of their oceanic elsewheres, and that to understand what brings them into being, we have to grapple with equivalences that seem not to be shipped in through the expected circuits of capital? That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Patel, for that wonderful paper, which sort of makes us think in a different way and provides us with a completely new perspective about ocean, the relationship between nations and oceanic spaces. So now it is open to questions, and the rapporteurs can perhaps read out questions for you.
Ruchi, over to you.
There is
Ruchi.
yes.
Okay.
I actually have Dilip's question, which I mean,
read the question.
Want to read it out? Yeah. Shall I read it out?
Should I read it? Wait, I'll read the question.
Yes, go ahead, Ruchi. Great to see you, by the way, even just in your name.
So he's saying great paper to think with, affinity, empathy, trust, benevolence, a range of effect that allows us to think through oceanic cosmopolitanism and the meeting of strangers on distant waves. Does thinking with Smith allow the imagination of an effective seascape, an interesting counterpoint to Alec Boehmer's invocation of Moby Dick and the ancient mariner, which signals suspicion and hostility towards another on the high seas?
And I think one of the things that's really interesting is I've been tacking back and forth about aesthetics on the high seas, right? Literally looking at the history of translations that travel on ship, and their shipping is actually often foregone, right? So, I went back and actually tracked the history of benevolence through the sort of configuration of benevolence as a philosophical and concept that underwrites governmentality, and realized that as people were talking about, and that includes David Hume, Lord Shaftesbury, and Adam Smith, and they were in this conversation with one another, that it actually, I say this in the longer paper, that it was incredibly, the sound of the pieces that people don't want to read in Smith sound remarkably like the Natya Shastra, which I've read in Sanskrit many times over, right? I was like, what am I looking at here? And why do people actually not want to look at this particular piece of Smith? But also Smith is writing at a time when, actually a bunch of translations have been done. And lots of people who work on Farsi, for example, have looked at the sort of traffic of translations between Britain and South Asia. And I realized that there was something, and partly I was also looking at the sort of language of pleas and letters and petitions throughout the UK, and in Europe, and realizing that there's a new petitionary culture that's going on. The bulk of the petitionary culture, although I look at petitions, I've been doing this for 20 years, looking at petitions of mariners and sea captains, and that includes pirates. And the language of those petitions were complicated, and people talk about an aesthetic, but they don't actually talk about the aesthetic. I mean, in some ways, the whole push towards the ocean is bringing the ocean into presence at times when it's often ignored, or the negotiation between ocean and land is bringing the land back into re-presence when the land is ignored. So what's interesting is, really for me, what I realized is that in not talking about the aesthetic, which includes, and this is what I love about the conference, I mean, it includes the aesthetic of, of Sufism, for example, right? Which is very ocean, the ocean is necessary to it, that they actually wanted to give up Adam Smith, and that you were stuck with an aesthetic of virulence, right? An aesthetic of just rage, an aesthetic that had the worst pieces of the form of the colonial encounter in it, through which the sea was manifested, right, or negotiated in, or, I mean, and what was interesting with Lynch is a really interesting character because this is the longer story, which fortunately my partner just told me not to write as a chapter, but do as a book, is that he's really, he talks on and brings into the conversation people who wouldn't be part of the colonial or the Crown archive, right? Is not part of the Dutch archive, partly because he's spent so much time living in and out of places that are not European. And so he actually is trying to, and as he's crafting, his aesthetic becomes more and more exquisite, right? It's literally trying to pull juice, rasa, water, out of people's beings. And he's working with financiers and with financing. I mean, it's a very, which I'll talk about in the book, but it's a very explicitly, mathematically detailed enunciation of what sentiment ought to have, right? And but he needs to do it not through numbers. He needs to do it through feeling. And so it's an interesting counterpoint. And he talks about what it means. Like, if I don't do this and you don't compensate me for it because I've paid, the nation doesn't exist. And he does it. I mean, it's a series of letters. I've picked up on one series because I wanted to actually in the book also think about the counterpoint between what happens when British sailors are enslaved, even though they have like absolutely horrendous lives. I mean, if you look at shipboard lives, the shipboard contracts, I mean, if you look at the work on Surat, I mean, my students actually have to study different kinds of contracts starting from the 6th century BC. And, the Indian Alaska is actually, Indian sailors don't, certainly in the 1500s and 1600s, hate European contracts, right? So shipping contracts are horrible, but it's still like they're slave, he's sort of fighting, struggling against a notion of Europeans being turned into slaves. And this is not the white slavery narrative, and meanwhile, this sort of, there's sort of stuff on slavery going on in the UK. But anyway, it just, what I really wanted to turn to a different notion of the aesthetic. Smith's aesthetic includes rage and grief and a whole bunch of things like the Natya Shastra does, and it's very nuanced. But anyway, so I wanted to see what the aesthetic would allow us to see on the seas, literally, a series of seas. So.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And we have one more question from Rukmini. Shall I read it, ma'am?
Yes, go ahead, read it. That'd
Okay.
be lovely.
So she says, this was such an interesting paper. That's a compliment, especially Professor Patel's analysis of emotions and sentiments in the petitions. Learned a lot from this paper, especially strategies of reading. I have a very brief question. She says, can we use E.P. Thompson's idea of moral economy to describe some of this material?
Absolutely. I mean, it is partly, it's interesting to think about not just Thompson's moral economy, right? It's literally because you're talking, but it's sort of slightly different than Thompson's. Benevolence is slightly different than Thompson's moral economy, right? Because, and I would ask you very quickly, when you think of Thompson's moral economy, what do you see in it? Rukmini, Rukmini, what do you see in it?
Hi, my mic may not be working very well because I'm sitting in a cafe and my internet is not working, so I'm not sure. Like I'm literally shouting and everybody's looking, but nonetheless. What I'm trying to say by Thomsonian idea of moral economy is this kind of very customary bonds, which slowly then by 1820s, 1830s comes under assault. And by Thomsonian moral economy, I'm also using this term very loosely to also like trying to also describe a lot of English social history tradition, like Captain Swing, and how these kind of moral economy comes under assault during 1830s and 1840s. Customary is becoming contractual and so on. This kind of very intersecting bonds where personal and contractual is not that clearly separated.
Right, and I think partly, Rukmini, did you want to turn your sound off? And I'll respond quickly. Partly, one of the things that's interesting is so actually one of the things that I think, so studying the stuff on paupers is really interesting because the work on pauperism actually gives gives Thompson, I think, the sort of the lexicon for moral economy, right? Both the economic and the sort of the specific lexicon for moral economy. And there's a kind of, Costumes in Common is very interesting because it is a shift, right? From a sort of a shared life to a life that's organized around industrialization in some ways, right? The breaking of the shutting down of the commons, the shift in the form of agriculture. I'm actually asking for something else, and all of my work is redoing. Some of it follows E.P. Thompson's idea of a sort of notion of the shifts, but the shifts that I negotiate with are deliberately somewhere else. And one of the things that Francis Lynch is doing is actually asking you to do something very interesting, to look at a transactional economy, and I wouldn't say a moral economy. So there's a difference between a moral economy and something that is outside. I don't want to use the word ethical because it has its registers at this time, philosophical registers. It's something outside the moral, and it's deliberately outside the moral because the form in which one shifts through the notion of pauperism is to think about deserving and undeserving. And he's sort of moving beyond deserving to voluntary, deserving and undeserving, that's language he uses, to voluntary. And that's something else quite deliberately. And then in other places, he actually moves to the language of benevolence, right? Which is a kind of largesse, but it's on the part of the poor. So one of the things I've been interested in is tracking the way in which poor in this period from the 1780s to the 1820s are making claims for their own financing through their own registers, right? Rather than being given something and therefore becoming a part of what I think Thompson builds his moral economy on. So I'm using the colonies quite deliberately because what happens in this period is a negotiation for a shift in the notion of capital is always Europe, right? It's either Europe. So the first book and this book work together. So I'm actually, a part of this book will be looking at mariners' pensions, and that the standard narrative on pension funds in the emergence of the welfare state is late 19th, early 20th, and mid 20th century. I refuse that whole lineage and tack it back. And this is part of, and so it's a whole, and it's actually asking for that lineage in the colonial state, which changes completely how we think of compensation and benevolence and welfare. And I think, and it allows us to abrogate contracts in a really interesting way. It's why my students study the history of contracts. Very interesting. Contracts in the 1600s and 1700s in Ramnad and on the other side in Kerala. Kerala, it's earlier, but it's interesting to think about what that kind of the idea of the contract itself in colonial times completely undoes the kind of philosophical and political economy of European-based contracts, right?
Thank
So
you.
anyway.
Thank you, Geeta. Sorry, I have to intervene because we're running out of time. But thank you very much for a wide-ranging, very interesting, very erudite paper. I'm sure there'll be many more questions to be asked later, but I can't say let's meet over tea and ask them, but hopefully we will have people to meet again and talk. Maybe move on to the paper by Kelsey McFaul. I'm not sure if I can be heard, but I'm a little worried about no.
You're okay. You're great. Hello, except you've turned off your sound, but
the sound is going in and out as I expected, like the tides. I can sometimes hear them and sometimes don't. So let me just invite Kelsey McFaul, who is a research scholar at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And her paper is called, rather poetically, The Wind Sketches Landscape of Words, Ocean Politics in the Horn of Africa and Western Indian Ocean. Kelsey, where are you? Yeah, please take over.
Thank you. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, thank you to Geeta for the wonderful paper. And I also want to thank, of course, the conference organizers who are all here for the invitation and for all of the planning and coordinating that's gone into this wonderful undertaking. And thank you for giving us all the virtual space to think through some of these important questions that have been raised in the last several days. And I also just want to note as I begin that it's quite early where I am on the West Coast of the US, and I've been staying up late listening to talks also. So I hope this is somewhat coherent. And with that, we'll begin. What I'm sharing with you today is related to my dissertation work on a multilingual regional Horn of Africa literary archive, but really what I'm focusing on today is more of a methodological question that gets at two of the themes that have been coming up in previous talks. First, the kind of comparative oceanic thinking, or oceans as heuristics, and the extent to which, when we're talking about the Indian Ocean, we understand that it's always already in relationship with what Glissant calls the subterranean flows of other oceans of the world, namely the Atlantic and the Caribbean, but the other ones also. And second, this increasing interest and attention to the material and climatological nature of the sea as element, and to Michael Pearson's provocation, which was referenced by Isabel and Lakshmi yesterday, about attending to a whiff of the ozone, or perhaps intentionally bringing a whiff of the ozone into writing about the Indian Ocean. So in order to do this, the methodological question I'd like to explore is, what does it mean to read a 21st century Horn of Africa literary archive, deeply shaped by its relationship to the Indian Ocean, in conversation with the Black poetics and oceanic aesthetics of the Atlantic and the Caribbean? I'd like to pause and think more deeply about the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds, not quite the ozone, but a climatological factor nonetheless. In Indian Ocean studies, we often speak of the monsoon winds as the region's animating force, the mechanism that facilitates trade within an ancient and cosmopolitan space and ties together webs of economic and cultural relationships and flexible internal and external boundaries. As a character in Abdulrazak Gurna's By the Sea explains, the winds of the monsoon have trafficked traders from Arabia, the Gulf, India, Sind, and the Horn of Africa every year for at least the last 1,000 years. In the last months of the year, the winds blow steadily across the Indian Ocean towards the coast of Africa, where the currents provide a channel to harbor. Then in the early months of the new year, the winds turn around and blow in the opposite direction, ready to speed the traders home. We're all familiar with descriptions of the wind like these. Perhaps we have even written them. Surely some of us have showed diagrams complete with colored arrows used denoting different winds to our students. For many of us, myself included, the wind has been a descriptive quality of the region uttered in the same breath as cloves and spices, carved doors and dows. In this paper, I would like to take this meteorological abstraction and give it theoretical weight to tease out its materiality and textuality, its histories and politics. How might the wind move from a trope of the region to an analytic? As a regional phenomenon, how might the wind and the weather it brings provide us with a different perspective and language to approach regional iterations of race, empire, cosmopolitanism, and environmentalism? I can't touch on all of these today, so I'll be focusing in particular on processes of racialization and a bit on cosmopolitan as well. In teasing out the linked poetics and politics of the wind, I'm indebted to and in conversation with the poetics of the wind in other places, namely in the Caribbean and the Americas. The wind plays an integral role in Aimé Césaire's Cahiers, for example, the cornerstone of Francophone Caribbean literature and Black poetics, and a foundational text of negritude, the literary and ideological movement that was both colonial critique and articulation of a global Black identity tied to the experience of the Middle Passage. In an oft-cited passage, Césaire writes that my negritude is not a stone, but takes root in the ardent flesh of the soil. Of course, there are many critiques of the version of Blackness that Césaire sets out, namely its hypermasculinity, which ends up reinforcing a master-slave binary or just replacing the master with the Black male figure. What I'm interested in here is the relationship to the land that Césaire develops and ties to identity, as well as the end of the poem, where a third voice, the voice of the wind, seems to emerge out of that binary. Heidi Kalikoff, in a feminist rereading of Cahiers, suggests that Césaire goes further than a reversal of the binary terms to provide a third space and a third voice figured through the wind, which defies categorization and definition since it can be felt but not touched, heard but not seen. The wind moves between and among and outside of the colonial and gender binaries Cahiers appears to maintain and give space to feminine and decolonial issues, the silent spaces of the poem. Reading with the wind helps us see that the poem concludes without its epic hero, but with the elements of a new order and the movement of struggle towards resolution. The wind is not merely a poetic device or even a metaphor, but for Césaire, the actual spirit and ethos of revolutionary change. So from Césaire's Cahiers, I draw the twisting, embraced, and deconstructive nature of the wind and connect it to Julius S. Scott's notion of the common wind, which characterizes the network of slaves, marrons, freemen, sailors, and merchants who trafficked intelligence in the 18th century Caribbean. The intelligence networks are what he calls a tempest that swept across linguistic, geographic, and imperial boundaries and relied on the distinctive landscapes of Caribbean islands, their mountain strongholds, accessible beaches, and narrow waterways, as well as the ocean itself. Scott's use of the term tempest intentionally recalls Shakespeare's Caliban, and through it the larger project through which Europeans invaded the New World in a collection of imperial storms. Christina Sharp uses the language of the weather to denote the ships and those who sailed on them to enact mass abduction, death, and enslavement in the Black Atlantic. Weather for her is the totality of our, meaning Black environments. Weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. Sharp is reading the closing lines of Toni Morrison's Beloved, lines which recognize that the prevailing wind is one of forgetting. By and by, all trace is gone, and what is forgotten is not only the footprints, but the water too, and what is down there. The rest is weather, just weather. If, as Derek Walcott says, the sea is history, meaning all the histories which have been forgotten and erased by the writers of the official record, then the wind, the weather, is the means of that erasure. The act of making something nothing or making it just weather is the method that creates the sea as history. So now, what would it mean to take the attention to the wind learned from Black poetics and bring it to the study of the Indian Ocean and the nexus between the Indian Ocean and the Horn of Africa, which is my particular interest? There are obvious caveats that come with this kind of comparative work, not least of which are the need for robust historicization and contextualization, as well as the fact that the Black Atlantic has been largely theorized by scholars trained and resident in the global North, while Indian Ocean studies is a field created and constituted by global South and non-aligned scholars. In addition, there's the hegemonic weight that the racial binary of the Black Atlantic carries in academic theorizations of race. As Isabel Hoffmeyer notes, the Atlantic model understands the boundary between enslaved and free is unequivocally demarcated and racialized, while the Indian Ocean's racial multiplicity and histories of enslavement and indenture complicate those binaries. There are strong grounds, nevertheless, for comparative oceanic work based on networks of Black literary and ideological solidarity across oceanic space, as Hoffmeyer, Sharad Trari, and others have shown. And in coastal East Africa, a similar poetic sensibility lives, a very similar one to the Caribbean, and in both cases, land forms the basis of personal and communal identity, though this is rarely studied in racial terms in East Africa. Perhaps by bringing Black poetics and Black studies to these lines of inquiry may push us in African studies toward a greater specificity. In the time I have remaining, I'll focus on just one example from the novel Adwa, written by the Somali-Italian writer Ajiaba Sego. Adwa is told in 3 historical times and 2 narrative voices, Zope and his daughter Adwa. Zope is a polyglot Somali who works as an interpreter in the 1930s under Italian fascism, simultaneously embodying and complicating the translator as traitor trope. Zope is a survivor of brutal racist attacks in Rome and a witness to the impending Italian reinvasion of Ethiopia. Adwa, the novel's namesake, was born in Somalia and raised in the pastoral hinterland before being uprooted by her father to an urban port city. The novel's representation of the coast hinterland dynamic that's ubiquitous on the Swahili coast and further north. Adwa escapes Somalia to Rome, and her tragic life there contradicts her triumphant name given to her by her father in reference to the first Ethiopian defeat of Italian imperialists in 1896. One of the novel's most significant scenes is Zope's arrival in Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, with his employer, an Italian count. Zope has visited the city many times before, but on this visit, it has just rained. When he and his employer arrive, they bring the weather with them. The count is there to plan war, and in conversation with a French colleague complains that, quote, Africa is so slow, end quote. The Frenchman responds by ruminating on the differences between, quote, cheap and, quote, efficient Arabs and, quote, lazy Abyssinians. This especially negative view of Abyssinians is colored, quite literally, by the Battle of Adwa, which festers like an unhealed lesion on Italian imperial ambitions. Italy's aggressive territorial expansion under fascism was branded as a reclamation of lands lost to Africans. Integral to this messaging, Angelina Pezzarini writes, was the production of the racial body via scientific racism with distinct terms for different racial phenotypes, despite apartheid-like prohibitions against racial mixing in the Italian colony. Such precision in the novel's case, such language precision, dispels the notion of any sort of unitary concept of Blackness in Italy or France and lays out a method of racial categorization keyed to developmental time, recalling Fanon's notion of the native as outside time, and to economics. In the Frenchman's racial grid, white European superiority is maintained via the savvy exploitation of cheap Arab labor, even as Arabs themselves remain in time due to their relative whiteness and business acumen. Zope, on the other hand, is classed as a, quote, darky bastard, a, quote, Negro, one of those Somalis with a blue turban, end quote. He is, quote, outlandish, a reference to the Oriental turban, his translator minstrelsy, and his perceived nativist relationship to land all at the same time. This assumption about land misreads Zope's coastal urban identity, and it's indicative of a colonial discourse that reduced African environments either to wild, uncorrupted landscapes devoid of people, or to a space peopled with human creatures still in their natural state. In this imaginary, Somalia is just, quote, wings and, it's just, quote, twigs and hot sand, the lunar solitude of the periphery, end quote, while Zope wears the landscape like a skin, quote, a thick layer of pink dust, end quote. European imperialists discuss African geographies as they do its inhabitants, as objects within an economic transaction. Says the Frenchman, we have Tunisia and they, Italy, will get Ethiopia. Seems like a fair deal. Given the racial gridding that has already bestowed higher value and intelligence upon lighter-skinned people, it is little wonder that the Italian Anselmi receives this forecast as an insult and refuses to reply. Instead, he shifts the conversation to, quote, meteorological matters, remarking, oh, Addis Ababa is so cold in the morning. Ostensibly a way of changing the subject, talking about the weather is a gesture akin to Morrison's just weather. Anselmi's turn registers a personal affront while managing to mask its racial nature and collapse a specific calculus of time, space, economics, and race into a generalization about African climates. Far from suggesting that European ideas of race are the only ones at work in this space, Adwa's climatological currents also make visible regional relationships and politics. Zope too uses meteorological language to mask the linkage of ideas of race and ethnicity to relationships to land. In the 1930s, when he arrives there, Addis Ababa is a young capital, less than 50 years old. Founded by Menelik of Shoa's wife, who was drawn to it by its hot springs, the city became the capital at the end of Menelik's aggressive military campaign to incorporate peripheral lands, including the Oromo land on which Addis was founded, into a core Amara empire whose center of power and culture was located in the highlands. This highly contested history of territorial expansion marked the end of roving military capitals and the beginning of the imposition of a high culture, i.e. Amara culture, on conquered lowland territories. Addis Ababa was the center of this new empire, and its status is solidified after Adwa, the battle Menelik wins with the help of guns from French Djibouti and Harar. The founding of Addis was a moment in which, Eleni Sentim Zeleke suggests, Amaras become Ethiopians and Ethiopians become the Africans who defeated Europe. They also, at the same moment, become Black as Ethiopia enters the imaginary of Black thinkers like W.E. Du Bois in America and Marcus Garvey in the Caribbean as the independent African nation exemplar and the site of diasporic return. International recognition caused foreign countries and businesses to rush to open embassies and businesses there. When Zope comments that Addis looks, quote, more modern and also, quote, angrier on this visit, he's gesturing at both the Amara project to position Ethiopia as a modern state and its military and political methods for doing so, namely land occupation and pressure toward racial assimilation. Zope references this history when he calls Addis Ababa, quote, a proud Oromo standing tall, and continually emphasizes the city as a representative of Ethiopian empire through details about its unpleasant, even aggressive weather. Quote, nature was not kind in Addis Ababa and even the air was hostile. He comments, the cold breath of the highlands hit him square in the face, end quote. We can read this emphasis on meteorological matters as a commentary on the destructive fury of a highland state, as well as an ironic mockery that a landscape chosen for its warm springs could be so plagued by cold weather. Zope's attention to and use of the wind and climate is more subtle than his European counterparts, but it nonetheless speaks to a certain configuration of regional empire and its forms of racial and ethnic hierarchy, which are often silenced in service of Ethiopia's reputation as the single uncolonized nation state in Africa. In conclusion then, and just briefly, we've seen how a particular meteorological element given analytical and ideological weight within the Black poetics of the Atlantic and the Caribbean can do similar work in the Horn of Africa and the Indian Ocean. In particular, if Césaire's wind weaves between and among and through the master-slave binary, so too attending to the monsoon winds as materiality and textuality allows us to speak with more precision about local and foreign histories of land and race in the Horn of Africa, and within and beyond and through the binaries of coast and hinterland, black and white. As a final provocation, I want to question what this method of reading the wind might make visible about Addis Ababa as a cosmopolitan city, stretching all the way to Ethiopia and running up against the mountains. The monsoon winds drop their rain on the capital and on the lowlands. Thus, meteorologically, Ethiopia appears to be part of the Indian Ocean world, regardless of its landlocked status. And Addis figures itself as a cosmopolitan city. Maza Bengeste, in her introduction to Addis Ababa Noir, characterizes cosmopolitan as, quote, distinctly national as much as it is international, constituted by over 80 languages and more than 200 dialects, which have wound their way into Addis and made it home, end quote. Zope too calls Addis an ambiguous, changeable, cosmopolitan city, quote, a puzzle of words in a yard of cloth. He compares it several times, unfavorably, to Mogadishu, since there, at least, in that pearl of the Indian Ocean, the sea soothes you. Addis's cosmopolitan nature raises more questions for me than it answers. What do we mean when we call a place cosmopolitan or a cosmopolitic? Might a mountainous landlocked city with coastal aspirations be so? And what makes such a landlocked city oceanic? A landlocked nation, a kind of island? Can cosmopolitanism be national? And what kinds of claims might a national cosmopolitanism be making about geopolitics, racial identity, and belonging? Does cosmopolitan inherently carry a racial charge? And in what ways is this contingent on history and geography, language, class, or diaspora? I think that viewing Addis as a coastal cosmopolitan city, which is something that I am positing here, but clearly still working through, invites us to rethink the relationships between nation, race, and cosmopolitanism, between the coast and the hinterland, between Ethiopia and its diaspora in India, and among ideas of Blackness in the Horn of Africa and the Indian Ocean more largely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. It was a wonderful, insightful paper. And I liked how you said that wind is not just a metaphor anymore, but an actual agent of change, which shapes and influences histories and movements and everything. So it was a wonderful paper. The house is now open for questions and comments, and there are quite a few in the chat box. I'll just read them out for you.
Thank you.
So we have first thought from Professor Dilip Menon. He writes, thinking with the wind as a framing space within which lives are lived and futures imagined. Wind as utopian, which is change and future, and as also dystopian, so cyclone, hurricane, etc. The wind and cloud in Indian aesthetics are at times associated with virha, separation and longing, and connecting separated lovers across space. Paintings of ragas, musical compositions that are related to the moods summoned by the weather. So wind, rain, or season connects up nicely with Geeta's paper in Now Thinking Environment alongside Effect. What is the ocean aesthetics that we can summon up to read present text? A fascinating set of questions.
No, thank you, Dilip, for that, and for, I think, kind of drawing together a lot of the connections that I'm trying to make in a very concise way. I think I love the kind of connections between Geeta and my paper in terms of what is an oceanic aesthetics, and we so often we talk about it, but what is it actually, like how is it constituted in the language? I think both of us are trying to get at that, and of course it has this longue durée sense in which you indicate. And one of the things that's not in this paper but that is in the larger project is the ways in which the wind is not kind of temporally bounded or periodized in the ways that we would often put a period or date markers on certain histories, like of course, the histories of the African continent, but the ways in which the Indian Ocean space too has been demarcated as kind of a pre-European time and then after European time and then now in this kind of post-colonial moment. So I think as an analytic, the wind, because it's consistent, but also tempestuous through all of those times is really useful for thinking past them in a way. And I love your comment also about the wind and the cloud in Indian aesthetics associated with Virha and the kind of separation and longing of bringing together lovers across space. I'm more familiar with the Ethiopian tradition where there's a term called tizita, which is also used in the same like nostalgic way, and it often comes up in musical registers and in song, and so that kind of like sense of the wind and what's carried on the wind as the kind of threads of nostalgia that are weaving people together, diasporas together, etc.
I'd like to, I'm curious, Kelsey, because I actually work with I've been working for a long time with Ethiopian artists and filmmakers and poets. And partly it started out of the Indian Ocean work, actually, many years ago. And I'm curious because one of the things that's interesting, I was thinking about that, the wind, and Dilip's question is really important to this, which is Addis is mountainous, right? Addis is on the mountains, and there's a sort of movement. So they're two different, because partly Addis is on the mountain and there's a movement from the mountain to the sea. So there's a sense of the winds carrying people and goods and objects and desires from the sea to the mountains and back. And that one of the interesting things about Ethiopia is a very deep history of both Christianity and Islam and Sufism, right? And there's this, and I was wondering, and the whole palette of Sufi aesthetic, which is about the ocean and the wind. So do you play with that at all? Which would be very different than going to the Atlantic, right? So I think partly the problem, so that's one question. And the other is, I think it will be interesting to think through, like when we go to the Atlantic, we go to the Atlantic. And I wonder what it would be like for you to actually look at people writing on the Caribbean in places like India and Sri Lanka. There's a very deep, Sri Lanka is an interesting place. I tell people to go for research there because it has some of the deepest newspaper archives on the Caribbean. And, you know, and a lot of people have written on the Caribbean from Sri Lanka. That's part of it. And as well as Africa. I mean, so what would happen if you played with the wind as a kind of movement, you know, that actually thought about like literally the seasonal, the north, and change the winds around against the seasons, right? So actually I love working with the wind because I grew up with it, but it's you know, I wonder what it would mean if you made the wind work against itself and shifted its flows.
No, thank you for that. And I think you indicate a lot of the terms of the larger project, which are interested in the way that the wind is moving and kind of moves across these landscapes in often conflicting or like cross-currented ways. And I didn't have time to go into all of that here, but yes, that's very much a part of what I'm thinking through. And as you mentioned, religion is of course a key part of this configuration as well, and spirituality and the ways, particularly in Ethiopia, the relationship between Christianity, Islam, and Sufism. And because Addis is located in the highlands and it's this Amharic kingdom that it, you know, is also the Christian kingdom, it presents itself as this kind of Christian island within the sea of Islam, even though the sea is landed before we even get to the sea as actual material space. And so that geographic way of signifying kind of cultural religious differences, which are also racialized, I think, in a very particular way, is something I'm thinking about.
Can I add one quick thing? So so it depends on when, right? Which time in Ethiopian history, because the last patriarch of the Ethiopian church actually went to visit Sufi on foot. He was very different. So it'd be interesting he actually walked on foot between church and church, between churches, and went to visit Sufi teachers. So it might be interesting to think through the history of the history of the church, and when it's actually it's moved with the winds of time, right? The winds of political exigency. I mean, it's just interesting. Ethiopia, the connections between Ethiopia and South Asia are so deep and so long. You know, you don't do Kerala without Ethiopia, for example. You really don't, right? You don't do the Deccan without Ethiopia. You don't do, I mean, so, you know, so it's, I mean, this would be great to think through, but it's really, the winds actually become a really interesting philosophical, theoretical aesthetic to work with. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that there's that distinction between the church as its own institution, and then the ways that it's kind of caught up in the nation or the state building project. And as you say, like, those are not necessary, they're not always aligned, and often they're at counter purposes. And the kind of the rhetoric of the state is to make this kind of like island religious identity, which is often, and there's a countervailing wind right there, the patriarch who goes.
Right now. So basically, I don't know if do you know Salem Mekuria's work at all?
A little bit.
Salem. Yeah, so she's a friend, and her
Sorry, there are a few more questions in the chat box now, and so we could just handle those and end the session. Yeah.
Okay, so there are 2-3 more comments for you, Kelsey. I'll just read them out for you and for everyone. So Professor Nishad Zaidi writes that I'm reminded of Mohsin Kakorvi's Naat, where wind carries clouds from Kashi to Kaaba. So again, an agent of carrier. And Momita writes, your paper is very interesting, Kelsey. Kudos. This reminds me of a piece by David Rubadiri titled African Thunderstorm, and she's quoted some lines. Clouds come hurrying with the wind, turning sharply here and there, like a plague of locusts whirling, tossing up things on its tail like a madman chasing nothing. It demonstrates for me power and resistance, what the wind, the nature, and people represent in the global cosmopolis. That's what she writes.
Thank you for both of those comments. Those are really rich and things to work through. And I love that poem and the ways that it's kept speaking to cosmopolitanism and like a global cosmopolitanism. So we now have moved from this kind of like regional Indian Ocean version to what does it mean to be kind of part of a global polis, and how does the ocean and the winds of the ocean kind of create those networks of relation in those forms. So thank you so much for the kind of engaged conversation, and Geeta especially for the comments and the encouragement for places to go next.
Great paper. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you as well.
Thank you, Kelsey. Now I would like to ask Professor Bhalla for the concluding remarks of the chair.
Somebody else please take over, because I'm having difficulty with manipulating this. Dilip, can you do that, please?
Yeah, maybe my concluding remark would be to say that maybe we must end this session right now. And thank Kelsey and thank everyone. So that's really a concluding remark here. But over to you, Stephen and Grace, and maybe you can take over from here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Geeta Patel. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Professor Menon. Professor Nishad Zaidi, Professor Alok, Bhalla, and Professor Simi Malhotra for joining us. We don't end here because we meet again tomorrow sharp at 10 a.m. and we are slightly packed tomorrow. So I think we should be more energetic and ready for tomorrow's jam-packed sessions. So have a great evening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.